In this lecture, we're going to apply our character terms to a work of fiction, in particular, Susan Glaspell's Jury of Her Peers. We have a few characters in this text. Martha Hale and her husband. We have the sheriff and Mrs. Peters, his wife. We have the county attorney. And we also have Minnie Wright, used to be Minnie Foster, Minnie Wright, and her husband. And of course, those two characters don't appear within the text, but they are the subject of discussion by other characters. And there's a lot of speculation about what Minnie did in particular and why she might have done things. So those might be some other characters that we want to think about too. In terms of our protagonist, main character in the text, Martha Hale is clearly a protagonist in this text. I think you can also make a case for Mrs. Peters being a protagonist, since those two characters spend most of the time looking through the items in the kitchen and end up finding the evidence, and they have those lengthy conversations with each other. And in fact, they work together to hide that evidence from the men by the end of the story to help out Minnie. So I think you can make a good argument in this text that we have multiple protagonists and it's the two women. What about antagonists in this text? So that's a really interesting question, because clearly it's not as though the male characters in the text are deliberately trying to antagonize or disrupt what the women are doing. In fact, they tell them, oh, you know, go ahead and look through these things. Oh, Mrs. Peters doesn't need to be watched. She's married to the law. They don't overtly seem to be in any kind of conflict with those protagonist characters. That said, the protagonists, especially when it comes to hiding the evidence, certainly behave as though they're in conflict with those men. And it's really in their official capacity as investigators that they become antagonists to the women. Once the women figure out what Minnie has done, and once they make that decision that they're going to help her by hiding that evidence, that's when we definitely could envision those men as antagonists. And again, it has to do more with their official role as investigators than any kind of personal animus or any even relationship between the men and the women. So this is a good text to really think through that notion of antagonist a little bit and put some pressure on what that really means. Obviously, there's some tension much earlier than that, and that falls along gender lines as the men are dismissive of the women, and Mrs. Hale certainly gets prickly at that, and you can see that in the language in the text that's used to describe things she's thinking, and even the way that she says certain lines. She responds stiffly when there's some criticism on the part of the men that Mrs. Wright wasn't a very good housekeeper, for example. I think Mr. Hale and the sheriff, they actually are minor characters. They don't have a very big part in the text. So let's think about the functions of those characters, because that's really a good way to address the analysis of minor characters. Mr. Hale is important mainly as a witness. He was the first one to discover that Wright was dead, and he was the first one to enter the crime scene and look at what was going on there, and to talk to Minnie, for that matter. So Mr. Hale really is that witness, and he's also the occasion for Mrs. Hale to be there, right? Mrs. Hale wouldn't be there at all, except that her husband was coming and the sheriff's wife was coming to get the things for Minnie and wanted a female companion to help her out with that. So between those two things, that's how Mrs. Hale even ends up in the story, and yet, as we talked about, she's the protagonist. So that's one minor character. The sheriff can be seen as a representative of the institution of justice. In a certain sense, he's almost symbolic. The law, and remember at the end it talks about Mrs. Peters being married to the law, well, that would make the sheriff the law. So that character functions almost in a symbolic way to remind and sort of hang over everything that's happening with this legal lens. And obviously the two women, as they're evaluating what to do about this evidence they find, they have to think through that framework, that legal framework, and determine if that aligns with another sort of moral framework that they're applying to the situation. And ultimately, it seems that they choose to follow a different kind of morality that doesn't completely line up with the men's idea of the law. That's how we can deal with minor characters, right? We want to think through what is their function. So let's turn back to those main characters again, Mrs. Hale and Mrs. Peters, and let's think about other characteristics: round, flat, static, dynamic. So let's think about some of those other ways of analyzing character, those terms round, flat, and static and dynamic, and think about those in relationship to our protagonists. I think this text is really interesting because you can make some arguments. So let me just talk through the situation, and then I'm going to leave it to you to make your determination about where you think they fit into those categories. Throughout this text, Mrs. Peters and Mrs. Hale are performing certain tasks, duties, right? They're doing a little bit of cleaning up. Mrs. Hale starts to almost reflexively do some cleaning up, although that cleaning up could also be hiding evidence, as with the resewing of the quilt she does. And through this work, they begin to make some discoveries. As they make those discoveries, they begin to understand something new about Minnie and about what happened in that house. They come to the realization that probably what happened is that Wright killed the songbird that Minnie loved, and that in recompense she killed him, and he broke the bird's neck and she basically strangled him. So a similar sort of injury. Once they realize this likely truth, they're faced with a decision. What are they going to do about it? Are they going to tell the men that they've discovered this motive? That's the one thing that the men are missing in order to really ensure Minnie's conviction is a motive. So do they tell the men that they've discovered the motive or not? And ultimately, that forces them to confront the notion of justice. What is justice? And that notion is inflected, I think, by a sense of community, a sense of understanding the situation that Minnie's in, the desolation, the isolation, having a cruel husband, and having a cruel husband who behaves cruelly to her. And there's a sympathy that the women have that influences the decisions that they make in that moment to ultimately hide that evidence. So here's the question, as people coming to this text to analyze it, here's the question we have to think through. Does confronting that realization that they understand Minnie, that they understand her life in a way that the men don't, and in a way that maybe the law wouldn't, that influences their actions? Now, does that change them? Does that make their characters change? Like I said, I'll let you kind of work that out and decide what you think about that, whether that makes these characters complex, meaning round, or consistent, flat, and whether or not they are changing, static, changing, which is dynamic, or staying the same, static. But that's what we need to think through. So that's how we can use these analytical terms. Simply by asking ourselves that question, it forces us to really think through, what do these characters do? What is the key element where we might see whether or not a character changes? Hopefully that helps you to understand how to analyze our character terms in a fiction text.